What's up, AP Psych? Welcome back. So we are moving on to our third personality theory in the psychology of personality, and that is trait theory of personality. So we've hit on psychoanalytic, psychodynamic, and humanistic. Now we're on to trait theory, and there's going to be a few psychologists that we talk about again that are going to be important to remember, and the theories that they put together. So let's jump right in. So if we're talking about trait theory, we have to understand the basics of a trait. So a trait is a tendency to respond in a certain way in many different kinds of situations. So it's something that trait theorists would say remain constant across situations that you engage in, and it stabilizes your personality. So trait theorists believe that every trait applies to all people and that the trait can be measured, right? So we're trying to make things measurable, make them more objective now instead of projective, right? So when we were talking about humanism and psychoanalytic, those are a little bit more projective theories. These are going to try to be objective and make them more measurable. And trait theorists also look for connections between an individual's behaviors, often asking what behaviors go together. So they're looking for commonalities. They're looking for examples of, introversion versus extroversion, stability versus instability, things like that, to see what behaviors we can attribute to a person's specific personality traits. So first up, our first psychologist is a man by the name of Gordon Allport, and he described personality in terms of those fundamental traits or characteristic patterns of behavior or dispositions to feel or act in a certain way. Right? And he identified 3 specific types of traits that he would say make up our personality. Okay, so first you have the cardinal trait, the central trait, and the secondary trait. And we'll talk about each one individually. So first, a cardinal trait is the characteristic or feature that's so important to a person that person is identified by that specific thing. Okay, so for example, Scrooge McDuck, right, in A Christmas Carol, everybody knows him as stingy and cold-hearted, right, to the point where we can describe people as being a Scrooge, right? That would be a cardinal trait, something that guides your entire life. Okay? Not everyone has a cardinal trait. Mother Teresa with her cardinal trait would be empathy, or giving or charity or something like that when you think of Mother Teresa. But there isn't necessarily a cardinal trait when you think of everyone, right? But it is this guiding characteristic that you're defined by if you have one. And then all of us have central traits. And these are traits that make us predictable in most situations across our lives, according to trait theorists, right? So for example, if someone's shy, they're going to be shy in most situations. Really not talkative. If someone's a flirt, they're going to flirt and interact with people. They're going to be extroverted. So these are central traits that really make up the core of your personality. And then finally, we have secondary traits. Just to go back to central traits, those are supposedly don't really change throughout your life, right? And a cardinal trait definitely wouldn't. But a secondary trait, these are the kind of the least important of the 3, and they can kind of change as you grow and develop throughout your life. But they kind of convey our preferences at the time in life that we're at, such as, music or food that we like. If you're a country music lover or you like Chinese food, right? Those are your secondary traits that describe your day-to-day, and they can change as you grow and develop. So those are the 3 traits that Gordon Allport put forward to the trait theory. Then we have a man by the name of Ray Cattell, and he used statistics or factor analysis, which means he looked at hundreds, if not thousands, of potential traits, and he used statistics to narrow those down to identify common traits and eventually develop a list of 16 personality factors that he believed made up the building blocks of each individual's personality. Okay. So he would say that everyone has the same 16 characteristics, just to varying degrees, kind of like on a continuum. So he started to narrow things down a bit, and we'll actually take a 16 factor personality test in class to see where you fall on Raymond Cattell's theory. So to further narrow things down, you had Hans and Sybil Eysenck, and that was a husband and wife duo, and they started to develop this theory that people essentially had 2 basic dimensions of personality rated on a continuum, right? There's extroversion versus introversion, and emotional stability versus instability. And this is going to connect directly to the Big 5 theory, which we'll get to in a second. But if you're an extrovert, you're social, you're outgoing, you're active, you're lively, you like interacting with other people, you want to go out, you need that human interaction, that's on one end of the continuum. If you're an introvert, thoughtful, reserved, quiet. You need alone time. You don't need to interact with other people. You value being by yourself. That's on the other end of the continuum. And they would say that most of us fall somewhere in between those two. That's one dimension. The other dimension is emotional stability versus instability. So when you think of these, you can think of kind of like type A and type B personality that we talked about before. Stability being easygoing, relaxed, well-adjusted. You don't get anxious. You handle situations well. You handle stress well. You're even-tempered. That's one end. And instability, oftentimes if you're that type A person and things aren't done exactly the way you want them to be, you could be moody, anxious, restless. You could get upset because you don't have the control over the situation the way you want it to be. That can lead to instability. Again, they would tell us that most of us fall somewhere in between that continuum of stability and instability. And as they develop this theory, you can kind of see this entire circle here, which tells you, where you can fall. And again, it's a continuum, so it's kind of like finding your spot within emotionally stable and unstable, which is also a synonym for that as neurotic, and extroverted and introverted, and where you could fall inside of this circle. Anywhere, really, could describe your personality. Now, those theories we just talked about, Allport, Cattell, and Eysenck, the Big Five theory has kind of taken all of those ideas and molded them together into currently the best approximation of basic trait dimensions. So the Big Five theory is not by any one theorist. It's a compilation of the work of many psychologists, and it's currently the most accepted trait theory in psychology. Okay? The traits, again, are rated on this continuum scale, and we'll see where you fall. So we'll talk about the Big Five here. First, you have emotional stability, which is pulled from the Eysenck model, right? It identifies individuals who experience things relatively easily and without getting upset. That's that type B personality, right? You're emotionally stable. The opposite is neuroticism. We talked about this, but you're constantly angry or worried or anxious or complaining. You tend to look for the bad rather than the good. Okay, so there's one. Now, it's important to remember that each of these of the Big Five is on a continuum. So emotional stability is referenced of the Big Five, but its opposite is neuroticism. So we need to remember that. Then you have extroversion, okay, associated with warmth, talkativeness, and being energetic. We talked about this earlier. We all know what an extrovert is. So that's one of the Big Five, but its opposite is introversion. So we need to make that connection as well. Then we have agreeableness, which involves being sympathetic, cooperative, kind, trusting, good-natured. Do you get along with other people, or do you seek out conflict? Things like that. Okay? So if you're agreeable, you do get along. Right? You're easy to make friends with, and you don't cause conflict. That's one of the Big Five. But its opposite is antagonism. Thinking to English class, what does an antagonist do? They're abrasive, they're irritable, they're suspicious, they're jealous, they try to create conflict, they try to stir up problems. So that would be your opposite on the spectrum from agreeableness to antagonism. Then we have openness to experience. And this describes people who are open-minded, willing to try new intellectual experiences as well as adventures and physical experiences, new ideas or creative things. Someone open to skydiving, for example. And the opposite on that end is resistance to new experience, where you're being predictable, you're conforming, you're unimaginative, you don't like change, you like things to be done, you like routines, you like things to happen the same way. Okay? Our last one of the Big Five is conscientiousness. Think of this as hardworking. You're dutiful, you're dedicated, you like to complete tasks, you're organized, you're responsible, and people can count on you. When you say you're going to do something, you're going to get it done. Right? The opposite of that would be you're impulsive. It includes tendencies like carelessness, you give up easily, you're being irresponsible, you don't like to make plans, you don't like to be held accountable, you don't like to have things laid out for you too perfectly. Right? You like to do things on impulse. Spontaneity would be another example. Okay? So that's, again, a continuum up there as well. So that wraps up our Big Five. Now, how are we going to address these and assess where you fall on these trait theory ideas? Well, we use personality inventories. Okay, whereas we talked about projective tests like thematic apperception tests and ink blot tests, those are very projective. Personality inventories and surveys are very objective, right? They're used to assess traits. Oftentimes it's a questionnaire on which you're going to respond to a wide variety of items covering all different types of feelings and behaviors. In today's world, the most used and researched is the MMPI-2, or the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. And that was actually developed to identify abnormal personality tendencies and identify personality disorders and mental disorders. But they've used it in a much more wider range today. And we'll do a couple. We'll look at the 16-factor test. We'll take a big 5 personality test. The MMPI is pretty big. It's pretty long, so I'll give you a link in class. We won't do it in class, but you can try it out for yourself if you'd like to see how it works. These are supposed to be scored objectively. You put in your answers, an algorithm spits out your results, so it's standardized for all people who take it. Right now, objective is supposed to be better in a way than subjective, but we have to remember it doesn't necessarily equal validity, because the more of them you take, you can kind of learn to fool the test and know what you need to answer to get the results that you want. Right? So that's a drawback to some personality inventories as well. But overall, we have to ask this question: is our personality consistent, or does it change depending on the situation? And trait theorists would say that our traits and our personality remain constant over time and across situations. Right? They would say there's not much change to our personality depending on where we're at in the situation that we're in. However, we do know that our personalities and our behaviors can do, and sometimes they change depending on the situation. You're going to notice this when we do our trait project. I ask you to get traits described about you from different people in your life in different situations. They're going to say different things because your personality can be a little bit different depending on the situation. And people don't act in predictable manners in all situations. So one's average personality as a whole is pretty predictable, but there are situational factors that impact it. And that would be the biggest criticism of trait theory. Right? We can't say that our personality is exactly the same in every situation, even though they kind of claim it to be. So that wraps up our trait theory, psychology of personality. We have one left, the social cognitive theory of personality, and we'll get to that later in the week. So if you have any questions, please let me know.